Markets and Finance commentator, but also assistant editor of the FT. Please welcome Gillian Tett.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I'm sure some of you might be feeling quite nervous hearing that I'm Markets and Finance editor of the FT. I'm not going to talk about the stock markets or about the finer details of credit derivatives or anything like that. I'm going to talk to you a bit about heritage from my background before I became a journalist, which was as a cultural anthropologist, because I did a PhD in anthropology, and I've always tried to incorporate that in terms of how I look at the economy and the wider developments in politics and society. And having just heard some very rousing words from Jenny, I want to bring it down a few levels to a rather more mundane piece of culture, which is the Disney movie Frozen. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Frozen. I imagine most of you, if you've got kids or grandkids, or if you haven't been living under a rock for the last year, know that Frozen has been an extraordinary success across the Western world in recent months. But there's something even more remarkable about Frozen as a movie, which is that a few weeks ago, Frozen the movie came out in literary form in both the US and the UK. And unsurprisingly, it was a big hit in the bestseller lists. But there was something else which actually topped Frozen, beat Frozen the movie. And that was a 700-page economics tract on inequality written by a left-wing French socialist called Thomas Piketty, an economist. He went to top of the bestseller list in America and did very well in the UK as well, beating the literary adaptation of Frozen. Now, if you think back to a few years ago and try and imagine a world where a left-wing French socialist economist would have come top in the New York Times bestseller list, beating Frozen, it would have been pretty remarkable. But the fact that Thomas Piketty's book about income inequality has been such an extraordinary bestseller says something very interesting about where we are today as a society in the wake of the great credit crash. And the key point is this: these days, people right across the Western world are thinking a lot about fragmentation and social cohesion. Or rather, they're thinking an awful lot about why we don't have as much social cohesion as people want. We have fragmentation in terms of income inequality, and that's why people have been rushing to buy Thomas Piketty's book about income inequality to such an extraordinary degree. But we have fragmentation in all kinds of ways in the world around us, in a potentially really quite troubling way. It's something that I see in my own daily life because, as I say, I was actually trained as a social anthropologist before I went to the FT and started working as an economics and finance journalist. And if you go back to the world before 2005 and 2006, when I went around and told city grandees, politicians, the people who ran banks, that I had a PhD in social anthropology, I might as well said I came from planet Pluto or Mars. I mean, back then, the only degrees that really counted when people thought about the economy and about politics were things like MBAs, economics, astrophysics. The economy was all about numbers, about quantitative things. But one of the big changes today is that when people think about the economy today, they increasingly realize it's to do with society, culture, the cultural fabric that holds us together. And people don't ask me anymore these days why I have a PhD in social anthropology and I write about the economy. There's a recognition that society and social processes really matter. But you can also see the issue of cohesion cropping up in opinion polls. I mean, I don't have time to go through the numbers right now, but poll after poll in the last few years have shown that people are increasingly concerned about the lack of cohesion, about the sense of social fragmentation, and the issue of inequality, which people like Piketty have written about. And you can also see it in politicians and political speeches. I mean, just before I came here, I went on the FT's database of press clippings in the last few years. And over the last 3 months, if you type in the words social cohesion and Britain, you get about 150 mentions in the British press. If you go back a decade or so, you get about half that. Social cohesion has very much entered an issue that people are aware of and talking about. So what does that have to do with heritage? Well, as someone who has worked in the field of cultural anthropology for a number of years, I think heritage is very, very important when it comes to cohesion. Because as Jenny has just said, in many ways, heritage is something that can potentially do great things in terms of cohesion. Heritage doesn't just help people think about the past, it helps them define who they are, it helps them think about the future, and it also helps them think about the kind of bonds that can potentially bring them together. But the important thing is potentially. Because again, another issue that comes out from anyone who's studied anthropology or sociology or cultural studies is that cultural tools and symbols can be very malleable. They can be used for good and for ill. And if culture and cultural symbols and heritage are going to be used for social cohesion, it's very important to think about how people are using culture and heritage to try and bind communities together. What does that mean in practice? Well, I think there are three key things that people need to think about when they're talking about culture and heritage and how it plays out in Britain today. One issue is whether the image of culture and the cultural symbols and the cultural practices people are preserving and celebrating are inclusive, not elitist. Many years ago, when I was an anthropologist, I looked a lot at the works of another great French intellectual left-wing thinker called Pierre Bourdieu. And Bourdieu, who some of you may have heard of because he did a lot of work which architects and other cultural thinkers have picked up on. But Bourdieu used to make the point that the way that an elite stays in power in any society is not just by controlling the means of production, but by also controlling the way we think, shaping the way we think, and eventually having control over the cultural symbols that are deemed important. And that can be very divisive. For culture, for heritage to be effective in promoting social cohesion, it has to be inclusive. It can't just be in the hands of the elite, because that really isn't about cohesion in a positive sense. Secondly, I personally think it's very important that culture and heritage is built on a premise that people never just have one identity. Anthropologists spend a lot of time talking about something they call the hierarchy of identities. It's an idea that's terribly obvious because we all know in our everyday lives that we don't just have one identity. We're not just attached to one place, one location, one sense of being. We have multiple identities. And being able to juggle and celebrate those multiple overlapping identities is actually absolutely critical in building a sense of cohesion that can be viable, fluid, and actually dynamic, rather than simply too fragile and rigid. But the third point, I believe very strongly, is the sense of culture and heritage has to be living, not dead. It has to be dynamic and forward-looking, not just backward-looking and static. And I say that with particularly strong feeling because before I became a journalist, when I was doing my anthropology work, I actually worked in the former Soviet Union. And I'm one of the very, very few people out there who's actually been trained in what was called Soviet anthropology, Soviet ethnography, that was created in the time of communism, and was actually a very flourishing, large school of thought, which has been largely ignored in the Western world, but it's fascinating to look back at. And when I was doing my studies in anthropology, Soviet style, what they called ethnography, the Soviet Union had a very vibrant vision of anthropology. They viewed anthropology as being all about culture and identity and the preservation of different ethnic groups' sense of social self and identity. But there was a crucial catch. For the Soviet Union, for the Soviet communists, culture basically stopped in 1920. Anthropology, as the Soviets defined it, was entirely things that happened before 1920s. It was stuff that was in museums. It was a kind of funny dresses that all the Central Asians used to wear. It was the funny songs and rituals and dances. And it was stuff they literally put in a museum. And when it came to writing books about culture, about national identity, they always had in the preface in the Soviet Union a little thing saying, this is culture and anthropology and national customs, they called it national customs, before the 1920s. And they presumed that because they were modern, somehow it didn't really matter anymore because it didn't fit with the communist ideal. Well, it's very easy to laugh about that now, but there's a tendency, as Jenny's just said, for cultural institutions, even today in the West, to assume that culture heritage is something you stick in a museum and it's basically sitting there in a silo of its own, separated from real life, separated from the dynamic sense that we all live culture in an everyday way. And when that happens, it kills it. It makes it dead. It doesn't make it a tool of social inclusion or social cohesion. It makes it something you simply put on a museum shelf and forget about. So I very much applaud what you're doing today here in terms of the debate and the exchanges. I very much applaud the fact you're brave enough to try and throw it open to discussion and reshape the boundaries and drag things out of their silos a bit. And I very much hope that what's going on will be very much a tool for social cohesion and social inclusion. The really exciting thing about culture is that it is so malleable, so dynamic, potentially so creative. And the very exciting thing about the world today is that people are questioning what makes us hang together as a society, if nothing else because people recognize after the great financial crash that we can't just go back to where we were before. So, best of luck to all of you who are working in different sectors, trying to find answers to these questions. And I look forward very much indeed to hearing what you have to say about how to chart a way forward in the next couple of days. So thank you very much indeed.